Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The session today morning is based on a chapter titled The Flowers in the Mother's Commentaries on the Dhammapada. This chapter, The Flowers, has quite a few verses from the Dhammapada, but I'll take up only a few of them for discussion, along with the Mother's comments on those verses. They broadly fall into two categories: some simple but very important pieces of advice and some encouragement for all of us, because we know that advice may be simple but it is difficult to follow, and therefore we may realize our imperfection, the gap between what we know and what we practice, and therefore we also need some encouragement that if we are truly sincere in our aspiration, gradually that gap will become less and we will move closer to the union with the divine, the ultimate objective of the spiritual path. The title of the session, Flowers Without Fragrance, is based on this particular verse of the Dhammapada. Just as a beautiful flower which is radiant yet lacks fragrance, so are the beautiful words of one who does not act accordingly. So here there is a simile given, a comparison given, that if a person speaks beautiful words but does not act on them, it is similar to a flower which looks beautiful but lacks fragrance. Good to look at, like the beautiful words, but does not radiate any good smell. And in the same way, the type of influence that this person radiates, the one who does not act on his beautiful words, is also not really positive. It's not, it's like the fragrance which is lacking in a flower, which may be an artificial flower, very good looking. And this reminds me of a couplet, सच्चाई छिप नहीं सकती बनावट के उसूलों से, खुशबू आ नहीं सकती कागज़ के फूलों से. So what is true cannot be hidden through some artificial or some fabricated, concocted principles or beautiful words. And once again the comparison is with flowers made of paper which cannot give us any fragrance. Now this gap between what a person may say and what the person actually does looks like something which is an act of hypocrisy, and it is, but at the same time one has to realize that the gap is not very different from what we know and what we practice, because what the person says, at least he knows that that is something good, that is something right, and it's just that the person is finding to put it into practice, and putting what is right is not always easy to put into practice because of the assumption that it is our limitation, limited capacity, or because of the circumstances and conditions in which we are placed, because of the obligations and responsibilities that we have, because of the conflicting demands that we face, and above all, the temptations that we experience in the real world. So these are all factors which may prevent us from actually practicing what we know, but that may not always necessarily prevent us from uttering those words, and that is sort of in a way a tribute to what is right by being paid by even the one who is not able to practice what is right. So that would be sort of the most charitable way of looking at this act of hypocrisy. At least the person acknowledges what is right, knows what is right, and but is not able to put it into practice. To varying degrees, this is a limitation that applies to most of us. Now, what are the consequences of this? Is it only that others would feel that, well, this person is a hypocrite, he doesn't act on what he says, or do the consequences go beyond that? If it is only that others will have a poor image of the person, that is a risk one can take, because firstly, the others may not be able to always discover this gap, because so many things that we may say, but in actions it is not expected that they will translate into very visible actions. The type of actions into which it may translate is the actions which are at the level of the mind, because what we think and feel is also a karma, that is also an action, and what the person says may be quite at variance with what the person really thinks or feels. So the gap may be at the level of the mind, and this is not really visible to others, and therefore one can take this risk. Secondly, everything that a person does, even visibly, is not visible to everybody whom he knows, and therefore most of the people remain quite unaware of what this person is doing, in spite of what this person is saying. And therefore that is a type of risk which is not a very big risk, and if that is the only risk involved, then probably this advice will not have as much significance as it looks. What makes this piece of advice extremely significant is that the consequences are the maximum and most serious and most important in terms of the impact that this gap between what the person says and does, or what the person knows and does, the impact it will have on the consciousness of the person himself. So it is that impact which is the most important, and that is what really matters on the spiritual path, because the spiritual path is about making progress in terms of consciousness, going beyond where we are towards the union with the divine, and that of course we know is a very long journey, but anybody on the spiritual path would like to take at least as many steps on the path as possible during this lifetime, and this gap between speaking and practice, preaching and practice, between knowing and practice, this gap will not in any way take the person closer to the goal. And if the person is truly conscious of this gap and yet is doing it with the feeling that, well, nobody will know, that really does not matter. What matters is that there is one consequence which this person can never avoid, and that is the consequence in terms of how it will affect his own consciousness, how it will affect his own spiritual progress. So that is what is the most important reason why such a thing should not be done. And in these verses, generally, each verse is followed by just also its opposite, and the opposite of this is a verse in the Dhammapada is, just as a beautiful flower which is both radiant and sweetly scented, so are the beautiful words of one who acts accordingly. And the mother, while commenting on this, says that there are some very wise recommendations here. For example, there's a wise counsel is never to utter too many eloquent words which are not effectuated in action. Speak little, act well. Beautiful words, they say, that are mere words are like flowers without fragrance. So this is one important piece of advice. And the other piece of advice is do not criticize others for what they do or have not done, but be aware of what yourself you do or have not done. Now, the criticism of others, how this gets related to that previous one is that the criticism of others may be based on the fact that we find a gap between the other person's knowledge and practice. There can be one important sort of ammunition that we have for criticizing the person, and before we do that, let's look within and realize, think about how much is the gap in our own case. So we should be concerned more with that rather than the gap that we observe in anybody else. And of course, apart from that, there are many other things also which others may be doing. or not doing, which we think they should do, and this is what may make us criticize them. Criticize them while they are in front of us, or criticize them behind their back. Criticizing them behind their back is what we call gossip. And gossip is a very favorite pastime. And one of the things that happens in this gossip is exactly this: criticizing others for what they do or they don't do. And again, the persons whom we are criticizing, especially when it is behind their back, may not affect them at all. They don't know it. Although, of course, there is a way of things going round and in circles, and eventually those people discovering who said what about them, and that can affect relationships. But the more important thing is, once again, the effect on the consciousness of the person who is indulging in this criticism behind somebody's back. And that's why the mother has said somewhere else that to gossip about what somebody is doing or not doing is wrong. To listen to such gossip is wrong. To try to verify such gossip is wrong. To retaliate against such gossip is wrong. And this whole thing is a terrible waste of time and brings down the consciousness. So this type of criticism, or any type of criticism, is not valid. However, the mother has given one exception also elsewhere, that do not criticize anybody else unless you think that you can change in the nature of this person that which is making this person act in this way. So if you are sure that this person should be acting differently, and you can change the nature of the person which makes him act thus, then you can criticize. Now, here the subtle distinction we have to notice, that the mother is not saying that if you can stop this person from doing what you think he should not be doing, then you may criticize. She's saying if you can change in the nature of this person what makes him act in this way. Which means that if you can change the very behavior of this person, and the way we behave depends upon what? Depends upon our level of consciousness. Which means if you can change the consciousness of this person, then you may criticize. But then criticism may not be always necessarily the best way of changing somebody's consciousness. And in fact, to take full responsibility for changing anybody's consciousness is in any case a very vain and futile type of an undertaking. It never succeeds. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that if there is somebody within our sphere of influence, we do not try to influence that person, do not try to raise the consciousness of that person. Maybe sometimes by providing a little nudge here and there, maybe by putting in a word here and there, maybe by setting the right example, which is the best way. So setting the right example ourselves. So there's no harm in trying to do it with that motive. And in fact, that is what the relationship between two people who are genuinely interested in each other's spiritual growth is all about. This is what Gary Zukav has called spiritual partnership. Now, spiritual partnership goes beyond ordinary friendships. Ordinary friendships are about celebrating when, say, one of them has some occasion which he looks upon as a happy occasion, as a piece of good fortune, then they celebrate it together, and if something goes wrong with one of them, both the friends then get together and feel sad about it. And also, if there's one of them going through a difficulty, then they sit down together, think about it, and the friend tries to see how I can help this person out through this difficult phase, maybe by providing physical help, financial help, a piece of advice, or whatever it is, or suggesting him about some contacts with whom he can be put in contact through this person. So these are different ways in which we try to help a friend. And when this problem is solved by both of them putting their heads together, then they can again celebrate, now the problem is behind us. Now, celebrating just because this problem is behind us by this some sort of manipulation, there's some sort of actions, some sort of things which can help the person come out of it is good. There's nothing wrong with it. At least they have, one of them thought of the other person difficulties as his own and tried to do as much as he could. So that's certainly good, and this will also, even without their thinking in those terms, raise the consciousness of both of them, because they have acted as one unit. They have dissolved the ego barrier between them. So it is not something wrong. But in the normal course, what would happen is that when the problem is behind them, they are once again on the same path. Their orientation to life is exactly as it was before the problem. So this is what we may call is treating the problem like a speed breaker. You face a speed breaker, you slow down because you don't want too bad a bump. When you cross the speed breaker, again you pick up speed and you are on the same path as before. What happens in spiritual partnerships is different. In a spiritual partnership, the problem is not treated like a speed breaker, it is treated like a T-junction. T-junction is also a problem, because one has to make up one's mind whether to turn right or to turn left. So if the problem is treated in the way the one we would treat a speed breaker, then they apply their mind and decide whether turning right would be the proper thing to do or whether to turn left. And after they have turned right, they have not only negotiated the problem, they are also on a path which is different from the path on which they were. They are not going straight on the same path as after negotiating the speed breaker. So the life has now got a new direction for both of them. So what this means is, a new direction means a direction which provides them, which has raised their consciousness and which has put them on a path which is more conducive to spiritual growth than the path on which they were earlier. So in a spiritual partnership, both the partners end up stimulating each other's spiritual growth. And this is the type of relationships which Gary Zukav has talked about, and this is the type of relationships Sri Aurobindo and the Mother visualized in the world of the future, in the world which is coming, the world which is not too far away, where the average level of human consciousness will be different from what it is now. And when there is a perceptible upward shift in the level of average human consciousness, that is the typical human consciousness, which helps us form an opinion about what typical human nature is like, because consciousness translates into human nature, and that is what helps us decide that. So when the average has gone up, then the view that we form of the typical person's level of consciousness and his level of behavior will change. And when a majority of people start acting from or behaving and from that higher plane of consciousness, from that reformed and transformed human nature, then the world itself will become a better place to live in. And what is the type of shift that it will involve in our behavior? Basically one shift, and that is a change from an ego-driven consciousness towards a love-driven consciousness. Because a lower level of consciousness makes us feel that this partial knowledge, which makes us see each individual as distinctly separate, is the final knowledge. So that is a limited and limiting way of looking at individuals. When we look at it from a higher standpoint, a higher plane of consciousness, then we find that this separation between individuals is only a partial reality. At the very depth, we are all one, because we are manifestations of the same divine. Our divine essence, that is the soul, is the same, and therefore what is identical in each of us is more basic, more fundamental than what is different on the surface. What is on the surface is our body and mind, which is reflecting only a part of what is there in the soul, in a defective way. The part that is being reflected can be different in different individuals, and that is why individuals are different. But the source of that light, which is being transmitted only partly and reflected only partly on the surface, that source is the same. In simpler words, we are children of the same God. We came from the same source. The essence of that source is within us. The essence of that source is the soul. but the soul is not able to illumine our body and mind completely, and that is why our body and mind behave as an instrument. Together, the body-mind complex behaves as an imperfect instrument, and one of the manifestations of that imperfection is that we behave in a way as if we are entirely separate from others, not realizing that our source is the same. It's something like this, you see, if there are a number of apples on a tree and they are plucked and packed into a box, they forget that we came from the same tree. And while they are sitting in the box, they start thinking that I am the best apple in this box. That is what the ego is about. And then you find justifications for it. One apple thinks I am better than the apple next to me because I am more red. Another apple thinks I am better than the apple next to me because I am bigger. And the third one thinks I am better than the apple next to me because I am sweeter. So each of them is trying to concentrate on what the most sort of admirable quality of that apple is, and comparing that with the apple next to it, it's saying that I am the best apple in the box. So that is what is ego. Whereas if these apples were to dissolve this ego, which actually they don't have, the apples don't have egos, but we're just using it as a simile. So if they were to dissolve this, then what they would focus on is that we came from the same tree, and therefore we are brothers and sisters. Now this feeling of coming from the same source and therefore being fundamentally one, this feeling of oneness that it generates leads to intimacy and love. Because after all, whom are the people that we love? The people who we think are related to us in some way and who are most similar to us. There are two basic things. So relationships can be biological, relationships can be other than biological. Now, as the consciousness expands, the relationships which are not biological also start becoming more and more real because we came from the same source. So the main thing is feeling interrelated, and the second thing is being similar. So people who look like us, dress like us, speak the same language, these are the people who think like us. These are the people who are more like us, and we become friends more easily, we feel one with them. So this feeling of oneness is based on similarity and relationship. Now, if we realize this deeper relationship which we all enjoy, in terms of which we are all interrelated, and this deeper similarity with respect to which we are all identical, that is the reality of us which is everlasting and imperishable, which will continue from life to life. At that level, if we realize that, then we start feeling one with others irrespective of the superficial differences. We still see the superficial differences, but those differences do not matter anymore. They cease to matter. That is what is important. It's not that we lose sight of those differences, and therefore it is also quite possible that we may not like everybody, but we can love everybody. So that is an important distinction to keep in mind, that we may not like everybody, but we can love everybody. And when we see it in this light, we'll find that even the dislike will go down, because we'll be able to take a more charitable view of the other person. The other person may be only an imperfect manifestation of the divine, but so are we. And therefore we'll develop a more charitable view of the other person. So this is what a spiritual partnership is about between individuals. And you might have seen that this type of relationships sometimes do happen, although we are not aware of our previous lives, but there are people with whom you feel a soul connection, which means you have a brief encounter which is apparently accidental, and then you suddenly feel as if you have known each other for ages. Now that happens because of a similar level of consciousness, which in turn would mean that probably we have had a long-lasting relationship in the other worlds before we arrived here in this life. Gary Zukav has given a beautiful comparison here. What he says is that it is like belonging to the same drama company. So people with a similar level of consciousness have lived in some other worlds before getting embodied again on this earth, and then on earth they got scattered. They got scattered into different places, and they may never meet. But some of them end up meeting accidentally through some brief encounters, and then suddenly feel this affinity because they were at the same place long back in the other world. So they feel that intimacy, that's an inexplicable sort of an attraction or pull, and they feel. So it is like being part of the same drama company which moves from place to place, and They perform a large number of plays. In all those plays, they have played different roles. Sometimes the two persons have played as brothers. In other, they have played as king and subject, servant and master. Sometimes in father and son, and so on and so forth. So they played all these roles. But fundamentally, they still feel that they are brothers because they belong to the same drama company. So they feel that oneness because of belonging to the same drama company, although they have played multiple roles in different dramas. So each life is like a drama in which we might have played multiple roles. In some cases we came in contact, in some cases maybe we did not even come in contact, but when we do come in contact, we still recognize each other as one because of having belonged to the same drama company. So this is what makes us feel that oneness. So digressed quite a bit perhaps because there was time, but this is what these verses are about, and we can take this as an extension from those verses, why we should try and act on what we know and what we say, and also not criticize others for the gap between their knowledge and practice, or for other reasons for which we may not like them. Even if we don't like them, we can continue to love them. And if we have to criticize, it should be only when we can change their nature. We can change the very way they behave. And that power is very limited. Most of the time we don't have. Why this distinction is important is because we may be able to stop the other person from doing it. For example, if they are working at the same place and one is the boss and the other is the subordinate, the boss doesn't like something and he tells him, don't dress up like this. From the next day, the subordinate comes in the type of dress that the boss likes. Or he says, don't come late. From the next day, he starts coming on time. Now, the person has changed, but his liking for a particular type of dress has not changed. His habit of getting late has not changed. So, really his nature, he may not have changed at all. So, that's why the mother says, and if you have the power to change the nature of somebody, then only criticize. But same time, again, there's another little exception that the mother has made. Should the subordinate therefore never tell anybody to come on time? Now, what she says is that if it is a part of your duty, then you can do it. Because then that becomes your duty, but then you are doing it without missing the fact that this person is still a manifestation of the divine. So you love that person. This little authoritarian attitude or anger that you are putting on is like a drama. So you are again participating in a drama, but you are not lost sight of the fact that you are still treating him as a manifestation of the divine. That sense of oneness, that connection, if you can maintain in spite of it, then you are just doing it as a duty, the way Arjun was told to fight without hatred for the Kauravas. So fight because it is your duty, but don't hate them. Now, these are all things which are very difficult to put into practice, and that is why there comes in among these verses also some encouragement. And the encouragement is, as the beautiful scented lily rises by the wayside, even so the disciple of the perfectly enlightened one, the Buddha, radiant with intelligence, rises from the blind and ignorant multitude. So, in spite of the surroundings being negative, in spite of the person being defective, the person can still emerge like a lily growing on the wayside, or as we may say, a lotus in a water which is muddy. So, it is still possible, and therefore that piece of encouragement that in spite of all the faults, and the person can still emerge from it. This emerging from any type of surroundings with any type of background is again important, because sometimes we feel that mera ab kuch nahi ho sakta, nothing can be done to me, I am beyond redemption. But nobody is beyond redemption. You know, you might know that parable from the Bible that a woman who had sinned, who had been caught red-handed indulging in adultery, was brought in front of Jesus Christ and told that, teacher, she has sinned, and the punishment for this type of sin is to stone her. throw stones at her. And what did Jesus Christ say? He said, the one who has never sinned can be the one to throw the first stone. They all had to look within, which means instead of criticizing others, look within. And then only you are entitled to throw the first stone. One by one, all of the people collected their left, because when they started looking within, none of them felt that they had never sinned, and so there was no stone thrown at her. So that is that sort of, which means that all of us are sinners in a way, but then every sinner has a future. And this is beautifully exemplified again by another story, the story of Ratnakar. Ratnakar was a dacoit who used to make a living by robbing the travelers going through a forest. And one day, the one who posed as the traveler was Narad, the hotline between heaven and earth. So he happened to be there, and this dacoit Ratnakar did not recognize him, so he told him, your money or your life, or something like that. But Narad was not moved, he remained completely calm. So Ratnakar was surprised that this person doesn't show any reaction. He is so calm, although I have threatened him. So then he asked him, what makes you feel so calm? So instead of replying to that, Narad turned the conversation the other way and told him, why do you act like this? Why do you commit these wrong things? Why do you kill people? Why do you rob people? So he said, well, I have to do it for the sake of my family. I have to take care of my parents, my wife, my children, and that is why I have to do it. This is the only way I can make a living. So I was told that, all those for whom you are doing, they neither can nor they would pay for your sins. You have to pay for your own karma. But he was not convinced. So he tied Narad to a tree so that he doesn't run away, and went home and asked his wife and children, wife and parents, maybe children he spared, that I am doing these wrong things for your sake. Will you share with me all the punishment that I may get in this world or any other world for all the wrong things I am doing? They said, no. It is your duty, your responsibility to take care of us. How you do it, that is your responsibility and that is your business. And if you do it the wrong way, then you have to suffer for it. So that was an awakening for him. He came back, untied Narad and told him, tell me what is the way to liberation. So he told him, chant the name of Ram. Now, he could not even chant that because his mind had got so spoilt, soul had got so darkened, he couldn't even chant the word Ram. So he showed him a dead tree and asked him, what type of tree is this? He said, Mara. Mara means dead. So he said, dead tree, Mara. So he told him, go on repeating that. So when he did Mara repeatedly, quick, at a fast pace, it became Ram, Mara, 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 Mara. So it became Ram. So then he told him, now you are chanting Ram. So he sat down and sat down for such a long time, and he was so absorbed in it that an ant hill started building around him. So after a long time, when Narad came again to look for him, he found that there was an ant hill, and from the ant hill was coming the sound Ram, Ram, Ram. So he undid that ant hill, out came Ratnakar, completely transformed, and he named him Valmiki now. Valmiki because Valmika in Sanskrit means an ant hill. So he called him Valmiki, and then he went on to, as you know, eventually compose one of the best versions of the Ramayana. So if that is what could happen to Ratnakar, every sinner has a future, but then we have to have that trigger, that awakening, and the aspiration to follow up on that aspiration with full sincerity. And the opposite of it is also true. That's why every saint has a past. The one who looks like a saint to us today might have done many wrong things in the past, and it is by his sadhana and the divine grace that he has become what he is today. So every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. Nobody is beyond redemption. And then comes the last piece of advice from the mother. Concentrate exclusively on what you want to be. Forget as entirely as possible what you do not want to be. Concentrate exclusively on what you want to be. Not what you are, but what you want to be. You want to be better than you are, concentrate exclusively on that. Better in every respect, involving all parts of the being, the body and the mind, so that they start working more and more in light of our divine essence, the soul. So concentrate on that. And equally important is the other part, forget as entirely as possible what you do not want to be. You do not want to go back, you do not want to become worse than you are. Forget entirely that. Why would anyone want to be worse than one already is? One doesn't want to do it, but it becomes difficult to forget it. It becomes difficult to forget it because we are attached to it. Because evil can be tempting. Evil can be considered a compulsion and an obligation and a responsibility, the way Ratnakar was considering. And that is why it is important to forget that. Both are important, and that's why this piece of advice. So I'll end with reading out the mother's words in this chapter. There are some very wise recommendations here. For example, not to concern oneself with what others do, nor with the mistakes they make, but to attend to one's own faults and negligences and rectify them. Another wise counsel is never to utter too many eloquent words which are not effectuated in action. Speak little, act well. Beautiful words, they say, that are mere words, are like flowers without fragrance. And finally, lest you get discouraged by your own faults, the Dhammapada gives you this solacing image. The purest lily can spring out of a heap of rubbish by the wayside. That is to say, there is nothing so rotten that it cannot give birth to the purest realization. Whatever may be the past, whatever may be the faults committed, whatever the ignorance in which one might have lived, one carries deep within oneself the supreme purity which can translate itself into a wonderful realization. The whole point is to think of that, to concentrate on that, and not to be concerned with all the difficulties and obstacles and hindrances. Concentrate exclusively on what you want to be. Forget as entirely as possible what you do not want to be.